Ukraine Calling.
Hello and welcome to Ukraine Calling, the English language podcast from Waschuk Radio in Kiev. I'm Andrei Kulikov, and my interviewee today is Roman Waschuk, who has spent many years at Diplomatic Service of Canada. He was one of the most prolific and successful ambassadors of Canada to Ukraine, has done a lot for the sake of these two countries, and during the Russian large-scale invasion into Ukraine has been and still is Ukraine's business-ombudsman. We spoke to Mr. Waschuk last year. You can find this podcast on our site romazke.radio. So my first question is, what has changed since the last year in Roman Waschuk's activities and in his life?
Ukraine Calling.
I would say that there's been a kind of abnormal normalization of business conditions. People have gotten used to a new normal. There are elements of it that are genuinely new because of the full-scale, large-scale, whatever-scale war situation, but others are unfortunate echoes of pre-February 2022 problems in the way the Ukrainian state, municipalities interact with business.
Can you characterize your activity as full-scale, or is it limited in any respect due to the normal conditions?
No, I think our team is fully engaged, both in person and whether it's through Zoom visits to the regions, or I'm planning a visit to Poltava this coming week. We're on top of things. We are keeping to our appointed deadlines for how long it takes to process complaints. We have a 10-day limit for preliminary assessment. I think we're now at 7-point-something days. Again, we have a 90-day term for trying to resolve issues. Our average is now again in the mid-70s somewhere. So we have adapted to the new situation. Of course, that's helped a lot by the fact that Ukraine's courts, administrative appeal systems, the bureaucracy in general is operating, which has with all of the upsides and also the downsides that come with that.
Whom do you report to as the Ukraine's ombudsman?
Okay, so that allows me to draw a triangle because it's not a direct reporting relationship. We are sort of equidistant with independence when it comes to the state. That's because we have a governance mechanism that has three partners or 3 points in the triangle. One is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development together with the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on the governance side. That's one corner. The other corner is the Ministry of Economy representing the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. And then in the third corner, there is a coalition of 5 Ukrainian business associations, the American Chamber, the European Business Association, the Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce, Federation of Employers, and the Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs, who represent the business constituency. So we try to position ourselves in the middle of that triangle so that we can be objective, both about the businesses that come to us, because we don't take every complaint at face value. We look at them first. That's the 10-day assessment period. Figure out whether they fit our criteria. Figure out whether the business is in fact being honest about its complaint. Because there are some, they aren't many, but there are some who are trying to exploit us and use us as a front for what are essentially dishonest deals. So we don't take those.
Or you think that you don't take those.
Or we think. Sometimes we discover only in the second phase that we weren't able to discover the full extent of the problem on the company side. But, in most cases, the problem is in fact with the government agencies that have been overzealous, not zealous enough, applied something not using common sense, or even going beyond the letter of the law in some cases, or being so literal as to make it nonsensical. So that's basically how we roll.
After receiving a complaint and perusing it and establishing that the grievances are legitimate or genuine, let's say, what do you do next? Do you pass the documents to the court? Are you an arbiter to some extent? And do you suggest that they settle out of the court or what?
So our whole thing is helping people settle out of court. In fact, as soon as it goes into a court procedure, we're out. Those are the rules. We are an administrative alternate dispute resolution mechanism. So, for example, let's assume that you own an industrial business, Kulikov Industries. Kulikov Industries. I
like that you pronounce my surname in a genuine Ukrainian way,
yes,
because I'm so tired of having my surname spelled with I. Kulikov Industries.
Yeah. Kulikov Industries, let's say, is manufacturing
something that is manufactured.
Kulikov merchandise dolls for all your fans.
All right.
Of Ukraine Calling. And for that, you buy plastic, you buy all sorts of, or maybe it's gold that they're made of, who knows? Anyway, you buy the various ingredients, components, and then you manufacture your final product. Let's say whether it's on value-added tax, they say, oh, we think you didn't really buy the plastic. It's a fake operation. So we're keeping the money you paid us for the purchase. We're suspending it in our government accounts because we don't believe you. But you've got all the bills. You've got all the proof. So then you come to us. We look at this. We say, yeah, sounds fair. We then write a letter on behalf of Kulikov Industries to the tax service and offer to accompany you to the administrative appeal tribunal there and basically help you formulate the argument, because you might be a great manufacturer, but you may not be an expert in tax law or administrative law, but we are, or at least I'm not, but my lawyers are. And then at the end of that, it could go either way. They could say, oh, yeah, actually the arguments you've adduced are real. We see that you've got all the receipts. You've got all the documentation. We may have been a bit too zealous in stopping your transaction. So we agree. We release it. We're registering your invoice. Carry on in your glorious industrial work. Or they'll say, we still don't believe you. And then you have to go to court. You're out of our jurisdiction, but you have our legal opinion that you can build your legal case on, so it doesn't go to waste.
Now I'm going to ask a speculative question, but are there any cases when you suspect a political pressure on those people who complain to you?
We've seen some of those. They relate most, I would say, to real estate, because the awarding of lease contracts in Ukrainian cities, especially for attractive pieces of land, can be subject to political influence. And if somehow through a bidding process, a person that those in power now don't like has a nice piece of land and is starting to develop something, suddenly problems can emerge. Suddenly an environmental assessment can show up and say, oh my goodness, this land that you bought 2 years ago, well, in 1992, it was supposed to be a nature reserve devoted to spotted frogs or something, or it was supposed to be agricultural land. So you may have bought it 2 years ago, but we've now discovered this incredible fact from the distant past. And so you are therefore a violator of environmental or other law. We tend to operate on the basis of purchasers acting in good faith. In other words, if you got all the documentation that said this is a legitimate piece of land, you bought it, then the presumption should be you bought it in good faith, and not that you are somehow guilty for a change in status that happened in 1993. So those are things that happen, and they happen because we've seen this in one case in one of the neighborhoods districts of Kyiv, where a deal may have happened before a change in political power occurred, and now people are trying to rewind the tape, to use an old expression, using very creative interpretations of legislation.
So how do you fast forward? Using the old expression.
Well, you try and put forward the arguments. One of the things that also then happens, and this is more difficult to deal with, is that essentially civil cases are criminalized. So you have a dispute maybe between two companies, but one company knows somebody at the police or knows somebody at the prosecutor's office. And whereas this is really a problem that should be resolved by launching a civil suit under the civil code in a regular court, instead, they will find one of these administratively oriented articles of the criminal code and say, we are now investigating. The prosecutors are on the case. The police are on the case. Everybody and their cousin are on the case. And at that point, it becomes more difficult for us to manage because Ukrainian law has very many provisions, one of which is that you cannot interfere in the work of an investigator, slichi. It's a criminal offense to intervene in the work of an investigator or of an investigating judge. So in those cases, we're able to point out procedural errors, but we can't actually address the substance of the allegation because that would go a step too far. So, but where we see the business is being harassed and is in the right, we try and find to see if there's some little bit of that case where we can express an opinion, even if we can't sort of encompass the entire proceeding.
Ukraine calling.
Roman Waschuk, Ukraine's business ombudsman in Ukraine Calling, the English language podcast from Romansky Radio in Kiev. We're talking about intricacies of Ukraine's law. And so my next question to Mr. Waschuk is, can he or his team be summoned to court to give evidence on cases that they are looking at?
Generally speaking, no. There has been an idea, and we are in a kind of thanks but no thanks mode about it, to have business ombudsman representatives present at searches of business premises. We believe that would be a bit of a conflict of interest from an ombudsman point of view. We should remain equidistant. As soon as we are summoned to the witness stand, either by the defense or the prosecution or anybody else, we end up almost inevitably pushes us into picking sides, which we shouldn't be doing. We should be there after things have happened for someone to appeal to us to assess whether this actually made sense or not, and not be actors in the event itself.
Speaking of Ukrainian and foreign business, which proportion applies to your activity now?
Right now, in the last quarter, third quarter of the last one for which we have a report in statistics, 88% Ukrainian, 12% foreign. But we do have some of the big companies, big foreign companies, Louis Dreyfus, which is a big grain exporter. We've been working on cases with them, but we've also worked with big Ukrainian companies, Oko, Kernel. But we also work with very small ones, individual entrepreneurs, the so-called FOP, the physical person entrepreneur format. And, sometimes I even ask myself, what are we doing here? We have managed to solve someone's 1,712 hryvnia problem with a fine or an overpayment or something. But that's because we are keeping to our commitment to work with any business, large or small, in Ukraine.
Theoretically speaking, may you be involved in this dispute over the Ukraine grain export, the blockage of Ukrainian border from the Polish side?
If Polish companies operating in Ukraine feel that something is wrong on the Ukrainian side administratively, they can appeal to us. And I've made that offer, in fact, at a press conference in Warsaw. Nobody's approached us about this. We have no jurisdiction over stuff happening on the Polish side of the border. Clearly, both I as a person and we as an entity disapprove of the unwarranted blockage of Ukrainian exports. And if there's anything we can do to help resolve any administrative problem on the Ukrainian side, we're happy to be invited to assist in doing that. But as I say, despite the fact that they're claiming that there is administrative harassment on the Ukrainian side. Nobody has appealed to us.
What do you love and what do you hate most about this job?
What I love, in a masochistic sort of way, is that to some extent, compared to my previous job, the ambassador job, it's a bit like flipping the telescope and looking at it the other way. So what I get to see is the kind of the inner workings of the Ukrainian administrative system, the tax system, the customs system, various other entities. And, so I sign and therefore I read long legal letters.
It's an interesting order. I thought you first read and therefore you sign.
Yeah, generally speaking, yes. Electronically. It all happens in our electronic system. I get to click at the end. But where the arguments are set out, and the arguments usually quote Ukrainian law. Mind you, we also cite the European Court of Human Rights on property rights, for example, as human and company rights. I think increasingly we'll be looking to other forms of European law as the integration process proceeds as well as a basis for decisions, but primarily Ukrainian law. So it's a kind of education in the realities of doing business in Ukraine. And that's when you realize that some of the generalizations that I may have been part of before don't necessarily work once you come down to the administrative nitty-gritty. One of the things I have learned, certainly in the past year, is that people coming from Anglo-Saxon countries, like me from Canada or others from the States, others from the UK, Australia.
Mostly Anglo-Saxon country, if we speak about Canada.
Well, yes.
Yes.
Yes, mostly, not entirely. But Anglo-Saxon in terms of the prevailing approach to civil and administrative law. Again, except for Quebec, civil code. But especially when it comes to administrative law, the situation in Ukraine is the diametrical opposite of that in these countries. And these are the countries from which a lot of projects, ideas, grants, whatever come. So in common law countries, everything that is not forbidden is permitted. I mean, that's true in criminal law, it's true in civil commercial law, and it's true in administrative law. In Ukraine, that is supposed to be true broadly in terms of the constitution, in terms of criminal law, in terms of civil law, but not administrative law, where there is the famous Article 19, which is in Ukraine, the government can only operate within the limits of laws and regulations, which in my humble opinion, non-expert, was a provision that was inserted with the very laudable goal that the government shouldn't be like a Frankenstein monster, go out of control, or Godzilla, and start crushing everyone and persecuting them in a Stalinist manner. But it's interpreted as one step beyond the literal word of some prescription, and you are liable to be prosecuted. So, for example, when your trainer, Canada-based, UK-based, whatever trainer says, you guys should really be pushing the envelope. You guys should be experimenting. You guys should take some risks in your project in government. What they're really doing in Ukrainian administrative terms is you guys should get yourselves arrested, either during or right after what you've done for the famous перевищення повноважень, exceeding your rights or exceeding your duties, whatever. And so people have asked me who work in Ukrainian government, they'll say, Roman, so when you were in your time, 32 years with the government of Canada, were you ever afraid of being locked up in jail? And I sort of go, no, I don't think so. I was afraid of being humiliated. I was afraid of being never promoted again. I was afraid of being not understood. Not understood, never being trusted again with managing a lot of money, whatever, if I screwed up. But, unless I actually went and strangled someone at the embassy, I was not afraid of being locked up on criminal charges. Whereas I think a lot of people in the Ukrainian government system are concerned about this. You have the case, which was mentioned to me a couple of days ago, of a former deputy minister of agriculture who in the initial days of the full-scale invasion was buying any sort of food, macaroni, whatever, to feed the army. at whatever price. And then all these rules that were designed to prevent corruption and all these other good things that these same Western donors actually like to are now being used to say he exceeded his legal rights by buying macaroni that was above the average price for macaroni over a 1 year period. Hello, it's early March 2022. Any macaroni you can get your hands on is stuff you want. So that then creates a disincentive for good people to go into government. And for those who are already in government, it makes them super risk averse.
Ukraine calling.
Roman Waschuk, Ukraine's business-ombudsman, is our interviewee in Ukraine Calling, the English language podcast from Waschuk Radio in Kyiv. And because he is a business-ombudsman, I cannot but ask him about allegations of corruption that, according to some sources, is flourishing in Ukraine, especially or also in the sphere of business.
I think Ukraine is a world champion in using the word corruption. Which then makes both Ukrainians and people abroad think it is, in fact, the most ultra-corrupt country anywhere. I think it's not. I think there are government integrity issues, no doubt about it. But part of it is because of these perverse understandings of the law and incentives. So, for example, if you are concerned that because there's a big anti-corruption campaign or an anti-whatever campaign, that you could be arrested for doing your job. Let's say you could I'll give you an example from our recent practice. You're a tax inspector and you know that there's a company that has a fuel depot at 41A Shevchenko Street. This month, when they submit their tax form, somebody forgot to put the A. And so this version of the form only has 41 Shevchenko Street. Do you call up the company in a common sense sort of way and say, I think you've made a mistake. All your other documentation says 41A. Or do you write out $1 million hryvnia fine for them hiding the fuel depot, even though it's right there in full view? The risk-averse approach, the super risk-averse approach, is to write out the fine and say, let the courts figure this out. Yeah, the government's going to lose in court, but I'm not protected for exercising discretion. A judge has legal protection for exercising discretion. Or I could weaponize this and impose the fine and then call the company and say, yeah, there's a fine out there, but if, for just 5% of the fine paid to me personally, we could solve this problem right now. But the most logical solution, which is just fixing the mistake with the taxpayer, is one that is discouraged by all the hypervigilance that is supposed to defeat corruption, but ends up in certain respects encouraging it because it makes decisions costly potentially to you.
You have not answered my question about what do you hate about your job, but I think that everyone who will listen closely may draw their own conclusions, or...
No, what annoys me about my job, I don't hate anything about my job. What annoys me is the feeling that we are, in certain respects, like a palliative care team, that we are dealing with the symptoms of problems, and that we can't always get to the origin of where it's coming from. Now, we have the right, and we are trying to do this in a different way now, to write reports based on conclusions we derive from the cases. So we look at the flow of cases and we say, hey, this is a problem now. I think our next, we did VAT receipts suspension as a theme. Tax inspections is probably going to be our next theme. But I think the underlying cause, and what I was talking about just now in the previous example, is that for Ukraine to really realize its potential, government officials have to be free to make common sense decisions and not be scared into passivity or scared into corruption.
And now I would like to use your rich experience in international relations, and as you are no longer the ambassador of one of the most important countries in the world, and especially important for Ukraine, I think that you may use your own discretion in answering these questions.
As long as I'm not weaponized.
Yeah, sure. Recently, we've witnessed some, let's say, disappointment in Ukraine about the levels and the rates of foreign help, and the maybe not prevalent, but a rather significant chunk of public opinion says that the allies or partners are looking away from Ukraine. What's your take on this?
I sense that some of this is happening. Some of it is inevitable. What is happening with the passage of time? The initial emotional shock and wave of Ukraine being invaded and very bravely defending itself and fighting off the enemy has passed. And you can't expect people all around the world to stay at the same emotional pitch as they were. Frankly, Ukrainians themselves aren't at the same emotional pitch they were at in April, let's say, of 2022. And then also with the passage of time, more and more extraneous problems pop up all around the world that crowd in for attention. I mean, the most obvious is Gaza, Israel-Gaza right now, but also various domestic issues and domestic manias and phobias in different countries that are not necessarily subject to rational discussion, maybe analysis, but not certainly with the people concerned. So you have the U.S. Republican versus Democrat rivalry, which is basically instrumentalized Ukraine, and Ukraine is sort of collateral damage at the moment of a bitter political fight that isn't really about Ukraine. And it's not because people really don't like Ukraine. It's because Ukraine is seen as, a year ago, it was sort of untouchable, and now it isn't anymore. It's like other issues that can be taken up as cudgels in a political struggle. In Poland, you've seen the transition from one government to another also being used by marginal political and economic actors for their blockade, and the outgoing government feeling it's not in its interest to expend any political capital on resolving this issue. So really, we're likely only to see some action on that front from the beginning of next week, when the changeover in government happens in Poland. So it's an extremely unpleasant development. It is disappointing for Ukrainians. It's disappointing to friends of Ukraine. I was having breakfast this morning with somebody who works on Ukraine in New York and Washington, and it means that instead of simply, friends of Ukraine spending money on buying drones, they also have to spend money on buying ads on Fox TV to talk to Republican stakeholders about why Ukraine's important. So it diverts some resources away, but it means that you basically need to work harder. It also means, though, that Ukrainian advocacy has to adjust to what is a new environment. You don't have to like it, but you can't ignore it.
What's the phobia in Canada about Ukraine? If there is.
Well, there is a domestic phobia. For example, I gave an interview to the CBC, Canada's national broadcaster, about the modernized Canada-Ukraine free trade agreement that the opposition Conservative Party voted against in Parliament because there was a mention of carbon pricing, which leads to their thoughts of carbon tax. And for them, their huge priority in the struggle, in the public political struggle with the current government, is to oppose a carbon tax of any form in Canada. Therefore, any mention of carbon pricing and tax in any document is anathema. Therefore, they oppose this document and claim unfairly and untruly that it imposes a carbon tax on Ukraine. That the Canadian government, just like imposing it on Canadians, is now imposing it on poor Ukrainians, holding a knife to their throat while they are fighting for their lives. Whereas actually, no, it simply says the countries will consult with each other on best practices in the field. And frankly, Ukraine already has a very gentle version of a carbon tax because that's a European Union association requirement.
You said that last year Ukraine was untouchable, but untouchable, of course, has at least two meanings. One, which we use most often, is stems from Chicago police or whatever. Yeah. The squad of untouchables, you just can't hurt them, you cannot. But the other is from the global south,
yes,
where there are kinds of untouchables,
yeah,
who are despised and so on. Unfortunately, for some people in the world, Ukraine is untouchable in this regard, just because it is being vandalized or whatever, raped by Russia and so on.
And possibly because those people will only recognize victimization if it happens to people who look like what they think victims should look like.
Yeah.
This is the problem, the sort of world championship of victimization that happens, and who has the right to be considered a victim and who does not. It is, I think it's become very acute now with Israel, Gaza, and the Palestinians. There are allegations that Western countries are being hypocritical in their approach, and there are inconsistencies. But of course, that same hypocrisy is evident in the campaigners who want to dump Ukraine, which is written off simply because it does not meet certain ideological or cultural or other criteria. So again, in an ideal world, everyone would be objective. Nobody would have blinkers, civilizational blinkers of any sorts. But that's not the world we live in. And when I say Ukrainians need to recognize and deal with that, it means that even if, let's say, a message or an approach worked well for you a year ago or 6 months ago, as situations in other countries over which you have no control evolve, your own way of framing your message needs to evolve as well.
Ukraine calling.
Roman Waschuk, Ukraine's business ombudsman, and before this, the successful Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, was our interviewee in Ukraine Calling, the English language podcast from Waschuk Radio in Kiev.
This is Ukraine calling.